Hey everyone, welcome back to our podcast, powered by the amazing Jet Off. AI team, we're so glad you're here, and we're to dive into today's topic. I have to say, I'm feeling a little like a kid on Christmas morning, because we're going to unmap the fascinating countries of Kiribati and Tajikistan. Are you ready to explore these two incredible nations?
I'm already. Mira, you know what's even more exciting? The fact that we got to experience a crazy situation last week that's still making us laugh. Remember when we were quoting the previous episode, and our coffee machine suddenly started spitting out coffee beans everywhere? It was like a scene from a comedy movie.
Oh, yeah. That was hilarious. And I have to say, you looked like a caffeine-fueled zombie, running around trying to catch the coffee beans. I think we might have set a new record for the most coffee beans spilled in one take.
Hey, at least I was trying to save the day. And speaking of trying to save the day, I have to say that Mira's dancing skills are still impressive, even after all these years. I mean, who else can turn a coffee machine malfunction into a choreographed dance routine?
Oh, Leo, you're such a sweetheart. But seriously, folks, we're glad you're here to join us on this exciting journey. We're going to explore the differences between Kiribati and Tajikistan, from culture to economy, education to entertainment. We'll cover it all. So if you're considering visiting, or even marrying someone from one of these countries, we've got you covered.
That's right, Mira. And don't worry, we'll make sure to give you all the insider tips and tricks to help you navigate these amazing countries. From the stunning beaches of Kiribati to the breathtaking mountain ranges of Tajikistan, we'll take you on a tour of the best each country has to offer.
And folks, we're not just talking about the surface level stuff. We'll dive deep into the culture, history, and traditions of each country, so you can get a real feel for what it's like to live and experience life in Kiribati and Tajikistan.
That's right, Mira. And, as always, we'll be bringing our unique blend of humor and expertise to the table. So, grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and get ready to explore two of the most fascinating countries on the planet.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, so you can stay up to date on all our latest episodes and behind-the-scenes fun. We love you guys, and we can't wait to share this amazing journey with you.
That's right, Mira. And, as always, we're brought to you by the incredible team at Jet Off. Aye, thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you in the next episode. Until then, stay curious, stay adventurous, and keep on exploring.
So when it comes to general safety and crime rates, our first country is Kiribati, a tropical paradise with a population of less than 120. Who wouldn't want to visit a place with crystal clear waters and coral reefs? But as we all know, paradise can have its dark side.
That's right, Mira. Kiribati has a relatively low crime rate, but it's not entirely crime-free. Petty theft and vandalism are common, especially in urban areas. I'm sure our listeners who visited Kiribati can relate to this.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that Kiribati has a strong community-based approach to crime prevention. They rely heavily on word of mouth and informal networks to maintain social order. It's like a big family, where everyone looks out for each other.
I see what you mean. It's almost like a traditional village system, where people take care of each other. But, of course, this also means that there's a lack of formal law enforcement mechanisms. It's a delicate balance between community policing and, well, no policing at all.
Well, it's definitely a unique approach. And it's not all sunshine and rainbows. As we discussed earlier, Kiribati has its share of problems, including poverty, overcrowding, and limited resources. But, overall, it's a relatively safe place to visit.
Now, let's compare this to our second country, Tajikistan. Tajikistan has a much larger population, over 9 million people, and a more complex crime landscape. They've got a mix of petty crime, corruption, and even some organized crime groups.
That's right. And what's interesting is that Tajikistan has a more formalized law enforcement system. with a national police force and a justice system that's slowly being modernized. But, despite these efforts, corruption remains a major issue.
Corruption is a big problem in many countries, including Tajikistan. It's a challenge to tackle, but it's essential for building trust in the government and the justice system. And, of course, for our listeners who are interested in traveling to Tajikistan, it's essential to be aware of these issues.
Absolutely. And I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most significant difference between Kiribati and Tajikistan when it comes to general safety and crime rates?
Well, Mira, I think it's the level of formalization and institutionalization of law enforcement. Kiribati's community-based approach is unique, but it's also less formalized, whereas Tajikistan has a more structured system, but with its own set of challenges.
That's a great point. And it's interesting to note that both countries have their own strengths and weaknesses when it comes to crime prevention. Kiribati's community-based approach has its benefits, but it's also limited in its ability to address more serious crimes.
Exactly. And Tajikistan's more formalized system has its benefits, but it's also struggling with corruption and institutional weaknesses. It's a complex issue, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
I'm actually curious about what others think about this. Do you think it's more effective to have a community-based approach to crime prevention, or a more formalized law enforcement system?
Great question. Mira, I think it's a combination of both. You need a strong community-based approach to build trust and social cohesion, but you also need a formalized system to address more serious crimes and provide a sense of security.
That makes sense. And I think it's essential for our listeners to be aware of these issues, especially if they're planning to visit or live in either country.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights we've shared today. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode. So, let's dive into the fascinating world of politics in Kiribati and Tajikistan. I'm curious. Leo, how do these countries stack up in terms of governance and social harmony?
Great question. Mira, Kiribati, with its parliamentary system, seems to be doing a decent job in maintaining stability. But let's be real. The country's fragile economy and reliance on fishing and copra exports make it vulnerable to external shocks.
That's a valid point. Leo, and what about Tajikistan? I've heard that authoritarian government has been making strides in maintaining social order. But
Exactly. Tajikistan's government has been known to crack down on dissent and opposition, which raises concerns about the country's commitment to human rights and democratic principles. But, on the other hand, the government's efforts to improve infrastructure and promote economic development are worth noting.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Kiribati would agree with me that the country's unique cultural heritage and traditional practices play a significant role in maintaining social harmony. For example, the Kiribati concept of tikau mana, or respect for the land and its people, is a powerful symbol of community cohesion.
Yes. And I think that's a great point. Mira, in Tajikistan, we see a similar emphasis on community and social solidarity, particularly in rural areas where traditional values are still strong. However, the country's rapid urbanization and modernization have created new challenges for social cohesion.
That's a great observation. Leo, and speaking of modernization, I'm curious about the role of technology in shaping social harmony in these countries. For instance, how do social media platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp impact community relations in Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Great question. Mira, in Kiribati, social media has been a game changer in terms of connecting people and promoting social cohesion. However, the country's limited internet infrastructure and digital literacy skills create challenges for widespread adoption.
I see what you mean, Leo. And in Tajikistan, I've heard that the government has been actively promoting digital literacy and online education initiatives to bridge the digital divide.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that Tajikistan's government has also been using social media to promote its own agenda and shape public opinion. which raises concerns about the country's commitment to free speech and press freedom.
Ah, that's a great point. Leo, and speaking of free speech, I'm curious about the role of civil society and human rights organizations in promoting social harmony and good governance in these countries.
Ah, yes. In Kiribati, civil society organizations have been playing a crucial role in promoting human rights and good governance, particularly in the areas of gender equality and environmental protection.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that civil society organizations are more effective in promoting social harmony and good governance in Kiribati or Tajikistan?
Well, Mira, I think it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique challenges and opportunities when it comes to promoting social harmony and good governance.
That's a fair point. Leo. And finally, I'd like to mention that for more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jet-Off. II for the latest analysis and expert opinions on global trends and issues.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and discussions on politics, social harmony, and good governance. In Kiribati and Tajikistan.
Let's dive into the economic conditions and cost of living in Kiribati. I'm sure our listeners who have lived or visited this island nation would agree that it's not the most expensive place to live.
That's true, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows either. Kiribati has a relatively low GDP per capita, and the cost of living is indeed affordable, but it's also one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change.
Exactly. And that's a major concern for anyone planning to move there. But, on the bright side, Kiribati has a growing tourism industry. And, with the right skills, you can find a job in the service sector or even start your own business.
I'm curious, Mira, how do you think the cost of living in Kiribati compares to other Pacific Island nations? Is it more expensive or less expensive than Fiji or Samoa?
Well, Leo, I think Kiribati is actually one of the more affordable options in the Pacific. The cost of housing, food, and transportation is relatively low, especially compared to Fiji or Samoa.
That's interesting. I've heard that the cost of living in Kiribati is also influenced by the country's remote location. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, Kiribati is one of the most remote countries in the world, and that makes it difficult to import goods and services. As a result, the cost of living can be higher than expected, especially when it comes to imported goods like electronics or clothing.
I see what you mean. And what about the job market in Kiribati? Are there many job opportunities for expats? Or is it more challenging to find work?
Actually, Leo, the job market in Kiribati is relatively small, and most jobs are in the public sector or in the tourism industry. However, with the right skills and experience, you can find work in the private sector, especially in areas like healthcare or education.
That's good to know. And finally, what about the cost of living in Kiribati compared to other countries in the region? Is it more expensive or less expensive than other countries in the Pacific?
Well, Leo, I think Kiribati is actually one of the more affordable options in the Pacific. The cost of living is relatively low, especially compared to countries like Australia or New Zealand.
Thanks for the insight. Mira, now, it's kind of like it's in. Let's move on to Tajikistan and compare its economic conditions and cost of living to Kiribati.
Tajikistan, a country with a rich history and culture. I'm sure our listeners who have visited or lived in Tajikistan would agree that it's a fascinating place to explore.
Indeed, and it's also a country with a unique economic landscape. Tajikistan has a relatively high GDP per capita compared to Kiribati, but the cost of living is actually quite low.
That's right. Leo, Tajikistan has a growing economy, driven by agriculture, mining, and remittances from abroad. The country also has a relatively low cost of living, especially when it comes to housing and food.
I'm curious. Mira, how do you think the cost of living in Tajikistan compares to other Central Asian countries? Is it more expensive or less expensive than Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan?
Well, Leo, I think Tajikistan is actually one of the more affordable options in Central Asia. the cost of living is relatively low, especially compared to countries like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan.
That's interesting. And what about the job market in Tajikistan? Are there many job opportunities for expats? Or is it more challenging to find work?
Actually, the job market in Tajikistan is relatively small, and most jobs are in the public sector or in the private sector, especially in areas like mining or agriculture.
That's good to know. And finally, what about the cost of living in Tajikistan compared to Kiribati? Is it more expensive or less expensive?
Well, Leo, I think Tajikistan is actually more expensive than Kiribati, especially when it comes to housing and transportation.
Thanks for the comparison. Mira, it's clear that both Kiribati and Tajikistan have their unique economic conditions and cost of living profiles.
So, let's dive into the world of accommodation options and quality in Kiribati and Tajikistan. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that finding the perfect place to stay can be a challenge.
I completely agree. Mira, in Kiribati, for instance, you'll find a mix of traditional and modern housing options. From beachside bungalows to more luxurious resorts, there's something for every budget and taste.
That's true, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local culture and how it influences the architecture. In Kiribati, you'll find traditional houses made from coconut leaves and wood, which are not only beautiful but also environmentally friendly.
Ah, I see what you're getting at. Mira, and in Tajikistan, the architecture is quite different, with a mix of Soviet-era buildings and traditional Pamir Highway houses. But I'm curious, what's the average cost of renting Kiribati?
Good question. Leo, according to my research, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Kiribati is around $500, $700 per month. Of course, prices can vary depending on the location and amenities.
That's not too bad, I suppose. But what about Tajikistan? What can our listeners expect in terms of accommodation options and quality?
Well, Leo, in Tajikistan, you'll find a range of accommodation options, from budget-friendly guest houses to more luxurious hotels. And, of course, there's the option of renting an apartment or house, which can be a great way to experience local life.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they have any experience with renting apartments or houses in Tajikistan? Perhaps they can share their stories and tips in the comments section.
That's a great idea, Leo. And speaking of tips, I've heard that it's a good idea to research local neighborhoods and areas before renting a place. In Kiribati, for instance, some areas are more prone to flooding, so it's essential to choose a place that's safe and secure.
Good advice, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that safety and security are top priorities when it comes to accommodation. But what about the quality of accommodation in Tajikistan? Is it up to par?
Leo, from what I've seen, the quality of accommodation in Tajikistan can vary greatly. Many apartments and houses are well maintained and offer modern amenities, such as air conditioning and Wi-Fi.
That's reassuring to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local culture and how it influences the architecture. In Tajikistan, for instance, you'll find traditional Pamir Highway houses that are not only beautiful but also reflect the country's rich cultural heritage.
Exactly. Leo. And speaking of cultural heritage, I've heard that Kiribati has a rich history of traditional architecture, with many houses made from coconut leaves and wood.
Yes. I've heard that too, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local culture and how it influences the architecture. Perhaps we can share some stories and anecdotes in the comments section.
That's a great idea, Leo. And speaking of stories, I've heard that some of our listeners have had some interesting experiences with accommodation in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Perhaps they can share their stories and tips in the comments section.
I'm sure they would love to. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice or tips they can share. After all, finding the perfect place to stay can be a challenge, especially in a foreign country.
That's right, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to research local neighborhoods and areas before renting a place. In Kiribati, for instance, some areas are more prone to flooding, so it's essential to choose a place that's safe and secure.
Ah, good advice, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that safety and security are top priorities when it comes to accommodation. But what about the cost of living in Kiribati and Tajikistan? Is it affordable for expats?
Well, Leo, from what I've seen, the cost of living in Kiribati can be relatively high, especially when it comes to accommodation. Many apartments and houses are well maintained and offer modern amenities, such as air conditioning and Wi-Fi.
That's reassuring to hear, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local culture and how it influences the architecture. In Tajikistan, for instance, you'll find traditional Pamir houses that are not only beautiful but also reflect the country's rich cultural heritage.
Exactly. Leo, and speaking of cultural heritage, I've heard that Kiribati has a rich history of traditional architecture, with many houses made from coconut leaves and wood.
Ah, yes. I've heard that too. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local culture and how it influences the architecture. Perhaps we can share some stories and anecdotes in the comments section.
That's a great idea. And speaking of stories, I heard that some of our listeners have had some interesting experiences with accommodation in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Perhaps they can share their stories and tips in the comments section.
Oh, I'm sure they would love to, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice or tips they can share. After all, finding the perfect place to stay can be a challenge, especially in a foreign country.
That's right, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to research local neighborhoods and areas before renting a place. In Kiribati, for instance, some areas are more prone to flooding, so it's essential to choose a place that's safe and secure.
Ah, good advice. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that safety and security are top priorities when it comes to accommodation. But what about the cost of living in Kiribati and Tajikistan? Is it affordable for expats?
Well, Leo, from what I've seen, the cost of living in Kiribati can be relatively high, especially when it comes to accommodation. Many apartments and houses are well maintained and offer modern amenities, such as air conditioning and Wi-Fi.
That's reassuring to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local culture and how it influences the architecture. In Tajikistan, for instance, you'll find traditional Pamir houses that are not only beautiful but also reflect the country's rich cultural heritage.
Exactly. And speaking of cultural heritage, I've heard that Kiribati has a... I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating visa and immigration procedures can be a daunting task, especially when moving to a new country. Let's start with Kiribati, shall we? What's the story behind getting a visa there? Leah?
Ah, Kiribati, a country so beautiful, it'll make you want to dance the hula. But let's talk about the not so beautiful part, the visa process. It's quite straightforward. Actually, you'll need to apply for a visa online or through the Kiribati embassy in your home country. Easy peasy, right? But be warned, it might take a few weeks to get approved.
Weeks? That's not exactly what I'd call easy. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the requirements. What's the deal with the online application process? Is it user-friendly? Leo?
Well, I wouldn't say it's the most user-friendly process, but it's doable. You'll need to provide all the necessary documents, including a valid passport, proof of onward travel, and a completed application form. And, of course, you'll need to pay the application fee. But, hey, if you're planning to live in Kiribati for a while, it's worth the hassle.
I see. So, it's a bit of a process, but not overly complicated. What about the cost? Is it expensive to get a visa for Kiribati?
Ah, no, that's a good question. The application fee is relatively cheap, around $30. But if you're planning to stay for a longer period, you'll need to factor in the cost of a residence permit, which can be a bit more expensive.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Now, let's move on to Tajikistan. I'm sure our listeners are curious about the visa process there. What's the story? Leah?
Ah, Tajikistan. A country with a rich history and stunning natural beauty. But let's talk about the visa process. It's a bit more complicated than Kiribati's, but still manageable. You'll need to apply for a visa through the Tajikistan embassy or consulate in your home country. And be prepared to provide a lot of documentation, including proof of health insurance and a valid passport.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of paperwork. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the requirements. What about the cost? Is it expensive to get a visa for Tajikistan?
Ah, now that's a good question. The application fee is a bit more expensive than Kiribati's, around $50. But if you're planning to stay for a longer period, you'll need to factor in the cost of a residence permit, which can be a bit more expensive.
I see. So, it's a bit more complicated and expensive than Kiribati's process. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's worth the effort to experience the beauty of Tajikistan.
Absolutely. And let's be real, the scenery is just breathtaking. I mean, have you seen the Pamir Mountains? It's like something out of a fairy tale.
Yes, I've seen the pictures, and it's indeed stunning. But let's get back to the topic at hand. What about the official procedures in Kiribati and Tajikistan? Are they similar or different?
Now that's a great question. The official procedures in both countries are similar, but with some key differences. In Kiribati, you'll need to register with the local authorities and obtain a residence permit within 30 days of arrival. In Tajikistan, you'll need to register with the local authorities and obtain a residence permit within 7 days of arrival.
Okay, that's helpful to know. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local culture and customs in both countries. What's the deal with the local culture in Kiribati and Tajikistan? Leo?
Now that's a great topic. The local culture in both countries is rich and unique. In Kiribati, you'll experience the Kiribati culture, which is known for its warm hospitality and rich traditions. In Tajikistan, you'll experience the Tajik culture, which is known for its stunning natural beauty and rich history.
I see. So it's a great opportunity to experience different cultures and customs. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's worth the effort to navigate the visa and immigration procedures.
Absolutely. And let's be real, it's not that difficult. Just be prepared to provide a lot of documentation and pay a few fees. But the reward is well worth it, the stunning natural beauty and rich culture of both countries.
Well, there you have it. Folks, a brief overview of the visa and immigration procedures in Kiribati and Tajikistan. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more. So, please do let us know in the comments.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more content on travel and culture. We'll be back with more exciting topics soon.
Alright, let's dive into the world of healthcare in Kiribati and Tajikistan. I'm curious. Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of healthcare in these countries?
Well, Mira, I think we should start with the basics. Kiribati, being a small island nation, has limited medical facilities and a shortage of trained healthcare professionals. It's a real challenge for the government to provide quality healthcare to its citizens.
That's a great point. Leo, I was going to mention that Kiribati high infant mortality rate and a low life expectancy compared to other countries. But what about Tajikistan? How does its healthcare system compare?
Tajikistan has a more developed healthcare system, but it still faces challenges. The country has a shortage of medical supplies and equipment, and the quality of care can vary depending on the region. However, the government has made efforts to improve the healthcare system, and there are some excellent hospitals and medical facilities in Dushanbe.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you lived or traveled in Tajikistan and experienced the healthcare system firsthand? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments.
That's a great idea. Mira, And speaking of healthcare, I've heard that Kiribati has a unique approach to traditional medicine. They use a combination of Western and traditional practices to treat patients.
Yes, that's true. Kiribati has a rich cultural heritage, and traditional medicine plays a big role in the country's healthcare system. But what about access to healthcare in Tajikistan? How easy is it for people to get medical care?
Ah, that's a good question. Mira, in Tajikistan, access to healthcare can be a challenge, especially in rural areas. However, the government has made efforts to improve healthcare services, and there are some excellent programs in place to provide healthcare to rural communities.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that access to quality healthcare is essential for a country's development. And speaking of development, Kiribati has made some progress in improving its healthcare system. But there's still a long way to go.
That's right, Mira. And it's not just about the quality of care. It's also about the availability of healthcare services. In Kiribati, for example, there are only a few hospitals and medical facilities, and they can be quite far apart.
I see what you mean, Leah. And I think that's one of the challenges of living in a small island nation like Kiribati. But what about Tajikistan? How does the country's geography affect its healthcare system?
Ah, that's a good question. Mira, Tajikistan is a mountainous country, and its geography can make it difficult to access healthcare services, especially in rural areas. However, the government has made efforts to improve healthcare services, and there are some excellent programs in place to provide healthcare to rural communities.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most significant challenge facing the healthcare system in Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Ah, that's a tough question, Mira. But if I had to choose, I would say that the most significant challenge facing the healthcare system in Kiribati and Tajikistan is the lack of resources and funding. Both countries face significant challenges in providing quality healthcare to their citizens, and it's a major concern for the governments.
I think that's a great point, Leah. And I think our listeners would agree that access to quality healthcare is essential for a country's development. And speaking of development, Kiribati has made some progress in improving its healthcare system, but there's still a long way to go.
That's right, Mira. And it's not just about the quality of care. It's also about the availability of healthcare services. In Kiribati, for example, there are only a few hospitals and medical facilities, and they can be quite far apart.
I see what you mean, Leo. And I think that's one of the challenges of living in a small island nation like Kiribati. But what about Tajikistan? How does the country's geography affect its healthcare system?
Ah, that's a good question. Mira, Tajikistan is a mountainous country, and its geography can make it difficult to access healthcare services, especially in rural areas. However, the government has made efforts to improve healthcare services, and there are some excellent programs in place to provide healthcare to rural communities.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most significant challenge facing the healthcare system in Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Ah, that's a tough question, Mira. But if I had to choose, I would say that the most significant challenge facing the healthcare system in Kiribati and Tajikistan is the lack of resources and funding. Both countries face significant challenges in providing quality healthcare to their citizens, and it's a major concern for the governments.
I think that's a great point, Leo. And I think our listeners would agree that access to quality healthcare is essential for a country's development. And speaking of development, Kiribati has made some progress in improving its healthcare system, but there's still a long way to go.
That's right, Mira. And it's not just about the quality of care. It's also about the availability of healthcare services. In Kiribati, for example, there are only a few hospitals and medical facilities, and they can be quite far apart.
I see what you mean, Leo. And I think that's one of the challenges of living in a small island nation like Kiribati. But what about Tajikistan? How does the country's geography affect its healthcare system?
Ah, that's a good question. Mira, Tajikistan is a mountainous country, and its geography can make it difficult to access healthcare services, especially in rural areas. However, The government has made efforts to improve healthcare services, and there are some excellent programs in place to provide healthcare to rural communities.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most significant challenge facing the healthcare system in Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Ah, that's a tough question, Mira. But if I had to choose, I would say that the most significant challenge facing the healthcare system in Kiribati and Tajikistan is the lack of resources and funding. Both countries face significant challenges in providing quality healthcare to their citizens, and it's a major concern for the governments.
I think that's a great point. Leo, and I think our listeners would agree that access to quality healthcare is essential for a country's development. And speaking of development, Kiribati has made some progress in improving its healthcare system, but there's still a long way to go.
That's right, Mira. And it's not just about the quality of care. It's...
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about Kiribati's transportation infrastructure? I mean, it's an island nation with a total of 33 atolls spread across the Pacific. How do they manage to get people and goods around?
Ah, good question. Mira, Kiribati has a unique challenge with its limited land mass and vast ocean expanse. They rely heavily on small propeller planes and boats to connect the islands. In fact, the country has a small fleet of planes that fly between the atolls, making it a fascinating transportation puzzle.
Fascinating indeed. And what about Tajikistan? Leo? I've heard their roads can be a bit rough, but I'm curious about their public transportation system. Do they have any notable bus or train networks?
Yes. Tajikistan's roads can be bumpy, but their public transportation system is surprisingly well developed. They have an extensive network of buses that connect the major cities, including Dushanbe, the capital. And, if you're feeling adventurous, you could even take a marshrutt car, which is essentially a shared taxi service.
A shared taxi service? That sounds like a wild ride. I bet our listeners in Tajikistan can relate to the chaos of marshrutt KS. But seriously, Leo, how do the buses in marshrutt KS in Tajikistan compare to those in Kiribati? Are they more frequent or reliable?
Well, Mira, in Kiribati, the bus network is relatively small, and the buses themselves are often old and rickety. But, on the other hand, the marshrutt KAS in Tajikistan are more frequent and reliable, especially in the larger cities. However, in Kiribati, the planes are a more convenient option for long-distance travel.
That's an interesting point. And what about road quality? I've heard that Tajikistan's roads can be in poor condition, especially outside of the capital city. How does that compare to Kiribati's roads?
Ah, yes. Tajikistan's roads can be rough, especially on the mountainous routes. But, in Kiribati, the roads are generally better maintained, especially on the main atolls. However, the lack of roads on some of the smaller atolls can make travel challenging.
I bet our listeners in Kiribati can relate to the challenges of traveling on small atolls. But, Leo, what about the impact of climate change on transportation infrastructure in both countries? How are they adapting to rising sea levels and more frequent natural disasters?
Ah, good question. Mira, climate change is a major concern for both countries, and it's affecting their transportation infrastructure in different ways. In Kiribati, rising sea levels are threatening the very existence of some of the atolls, making it harder to maintain roads and other infrastructure. In Tajikistan, climate change is causing more frequent landslides and floods, which are damaging the roads and bridges.
That's a sobering thought. Leo, and what about the role of technology in improving transportation infrastructure in both countries? Are there any innovative solutions or initiatives that are making a difference?
Ah, yes. Technology is playing a big role in improving transportation infrastructure in both countries. In Kiribati, they're using drones to monitor the condition of the roads and bridges, which helps them identify areas that need maintenance. In Tajikistan, they're using mobile apps to provide real-time information about bus schedules and routes, making it easier for passengers to plan their journeys.
That's fascinating. Leo, I bet our listeners in Kiribati and Tajikistan are to hear about these innovative solutions. And finally, what advice would you give to travelers heading to either country? Any tips or tricks for navigating the transportation systems?
Ah, good question. Mira, if you're heading to Kiribati, be prepared for the unpredictable weather and the challenges of traveling on small atolls. And if you're heading to Tajikistan, be prepared for the rough roads and the crowded buses. But overall, both countries offer a unique and rewarding travel experience. And with a little planning and flexibility, you can navigate the transportation systems with ease.
Thanks for the tips. Leah, I think our listeners will appreciate the insider knowledge. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to share below. We love hearing from you. So, language barriers and ease of communication in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Let's dive in. I'm curious. Leo, how do you think language affects the experience of living in these two countries?
Well, Mira, language is a huge aspect of any culture, and both Kiribati and Tajikistan have their unique linguistic challenges. In Kiribati, the official language is Gilberti, but English is widely spoken, especially in the tourism industry. On the other hand, Tajikistan has two official languages, Tajik and Russian, with many locals also speaking English.
That's a great point. And I'm sure our listeners living in Kiribati would agree that English is a lifesaver when communicating with tourists and foreigners. But have you ever tried ordering a traditional meal in Kiribati? Leah? It's like a puzzle trying to find the right words.
Oh, Mira, you're right. I remember trying to order a traditional Kiribati dish called kabi kai and getting totally confused. But the locals were so patient and helpful. It was like they were speaking a different language altogether.
I'm sure that's an experience many of us can relate to. And speaking of languages, in Tajikistan, I've heard that the language is quite complex, with many nuances and idioms. How do you think expats and tourists can navigate this language barrier? Leah?
That's a great question. Mira, I think the key is to learn a few basic phrases and be open to making mistakes. In Tajikistan, many locals are eager to practice their English skills, so it's not uncommon to find someone who wants to chat with you. And with the help of translation apps and dictionaries, it's easier than ever to communicate.
That's so true. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that making an effort to learn the local language can go a long way in breaking down cultural barriers. But what about language learning resources? Leo, are there any good websites or language exchange programs that you'd recommend?
Actually, Mira, I found a great language exchange program called iTalki that connects you with native speakers. And for learning resources, I recommend the website Language Guide, which has a comprehensive guide to the Tajik language.
Thanks for sharing that. Leah, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the resources. And speaking of resources, have you ever tried using social media to connect with locals in Kiribati or Tajikistan? Leo?
Yes. Social media is a great way to connect with locals and learn about their culture. In Kiribati, I've joined a few Facebook groups for expats and locals, and it's been a great way to learn about the culture and get tips on language.
That's a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that social media can be a powerful tool for cultural exchange. But what about language learning apps? Leo, are there any good ones that you'd recommend for learning Gilberti or Tajik?
Actually, Mira, I found a great app called Duolingo that has a comprehensive course on the Tajik language. And for Gilberti, I recommend the app Hello Talk, which connects you with native speakers.
Thanks for sharing that. Leah, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate your recommendations. And finally, what advice would you give to our listeners who are planning to visit or live in Kiribati or Tajikistan? Leo?
That's a great question. Mira, I would say that the key to navigating language barriers is to be open-minded, patient, and willing to learn. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, and always be willing to ask for help. And most importantly, enjoy the experience and learn as much as you can about the culture.
I couldn't agree more. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the advice. Thanks for sharing your expertise. Leah,
Thanks. Mira, it's been a pleasure discussing language barriers and ease of communication in Kiribati and Tajikistan.
and to our listeners, don't forget to share your own experiences and tips in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.
And if you're planning to visit or live in Kiribati or Tajikistan, don't forget to learn a few basic phrases and be open to making mistakes. It'll make all the difference in your experience.
And finally, if you're feeling adventurous, try learning some traditional dances or songs from Kiribati or Tajikistan. It's a great way to connect with the culture and make new friends.
That's a great idea, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the tips. Thanks for joining us on this episode.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more episodes on language barriers and ease of communication in different countries around the world.
And if you have any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, feel free to reach out to us on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
Dive into the fascinating world of cultural diversity and tolerance in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Both countries have unique approaches to embracing differences and fostering social cohesion. I'm curious. Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Kiribati?
Ah, yes. The Gilbert Islands, where the locals are known for their warm hospitality and love for storytelling. I've heard that in Kiribati, the concept of Tikau Mandoki, or we are all one, is deeply ingrained in the culture. It's all about unity and respect for one another.
That's beautiful. I've always been fascinated by the Pacific Island cultures, and it's great to see how they prioritize community and respect. In Tajikistan, on the other hand, we have a more complex history with multiple ethnic groups and languages. How do you think Tajikistan's cultural diversity is reflected in its society?
Well, Mira, Tajikistan has a rich cultural heritage, with the Tajik people being the majority, followed by Uzbek, Russian, and other minority groups. The country has a strong tradition of hospitality, and visitors are often greeted with open arms and warm. However, I've also heard that there are tensions between the different ethnic groups, particularly in the eastern regions.
Yes, I've read about the tensions between the Tajik and Uzbek communities. It's a complex issue, but I'm sure our listeners living in Tajikistan would agree that the country's cultural diversity is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brings people together, but on the other hand, it can create divisions. Let's talk about some of the social harmony initiatives in Kiribati and Tajikistan.
Ah, great idea. Mira, in Kiribati, I've heard that the government has implemented programs to promote cultural exchange and understanding between the different island groups. They also have a strong focus on traditional arts and crafts, which helps to preserve the country's cultural heritage.
That's wonderful. In Tajikistan, I've seen that the government has also launched initiatives to promote cultural diversity and tolerance. They have programs to support minority languages and cultures. And they also have a strong focus on education and cultural exchange.
Yes, education is key in promoting cultural understanding and tolerance. In Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many programs and initiatives to promote cultural diversity and inclusion, particularly in the areas of education and healthcare.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that education is the key to promoting cultural diversity and tolerance in both Kiribati and Tajikistan?
I think it's a big part of it, Mira, but it's not the only factor. I think that community-based initiatives and grassroots programs can also play a big role in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance.
Absolutely. Community-based initiatives can be incredibly powerful in promoting cultural understanding and tolerance. In Kiribati, I've heard that the local communities are actively working together to preserve their cultural heritage and promote cultural exchange.
That's great to hear. Mira, I think that's a big part of what makes Kiribati so unique and special. The local communities are truly the backbone of the country's cultural diversity and tolerance.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Kiribati would agree with me. The country's cultural diversity is not just a source of pride, but also a source of strength. And I think that's something that we can all learn from.
Well said. Mira, I think that's a great way to wrap up our discussion on cultural diversity and tolerance in Kiribati and Tajikistan. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot from it.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners will continue to learn more about these amazing countries and their cultures. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more fascinating conversations and insights into the world's most incredible cultures.
And if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We love hearing from our listeners and learning from their experiences.
Well, that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever heard of Kiribati? It's a small island nation in the Pacific, and their education system is quite unique. They have a strong focus on community-based learning, which I find really fascinating.
Kiribati. Yes, I've heard of it. It's actually known for its high literacy rate, considering the country's small size and limited resources. I've read that they have a strong emphasis on traditional knowledge and cultural values in their education system. That's really interesting.
Exactly. And what I love about Kiribati is that they're not just teaching academic subjects, but also skills like fishing and navigation. These are essential for the islanders to survive and thrive in their environment.
That's amazing. I've also heard that Kiribati has a strong tradition of storytelling and oral history, which is passed down from generation to generation. I'm sure that's a big part of their educational system as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's wonderful that they're preserving their cultural heritage in such a unique way. I'm sure our listeners living in Kiribati would agree with me that community-based learning is a vital part of their education system.
I'm sure they would. And speaking of unique educational systems, have you ever heard of Tajikistan? They have a fascinating approach to education, especially when it comes to language acquisition.
Oh, Tajikistan. Yes, I've heard of it. But tell me more about their education system. I'm curious to know how they approach language learning.
Well, in Tajikistan, they have a strong focus on languages like Russian and English, which are essential for communication and trade. But what's really interesting is that they're also preserving their local languages, such as Tajik and Russian, which are spoken by the majority of the population.
That's great to hear. I think it's wonderful that they're promoting linguistic diversity and preserving their cultural heritage. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that language acquisition is a crucial part of any education system.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that Tajikistan has made significant progress in improving access to education, especially for girls and women. They've implemented programs to increase girls' enrollment in schools and reduce dropout rates.
That's fantastic. And I'm curious to know more about the language schools in Tajikistan. Are they well established and reputable? Or are they still developing?
Oh, good question. From what I've researched, the language schools in Tajikistan are generally well regarded and offer a range of courses, including English language training. However, I think it's worth noting that some of these schools may not have the same level of resources or infrastructure as schools in more developed countries.
I see. Well, it's always interesting to learn about the challenges and opportunities faced by different education systems around the world. And I think it's wonderful that we can share our knowledge and experiences with each other and with our listeners.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both Kiribati and Tajikistan have unique strengths and challenges when it comes to education. But overall, I think it's clear that both countries are committed to providing high-quality education to their citizens.
I couldn't agree more. Leah, and I think it's wonderful that we can learn from each other and share our perspectives on education. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think we've got a great discussion going, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights we shared today. Well, that's all for now. Let's move on to the next topic and see what other interesting conversations we can have.
I'm curious about the climate in Kiribati, which is known for its tropical marine climate. What's interesting is that the temperature remains relatively constant throughout the year, with average highs around 88 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's not surprising, considering its location near the equator. But what's fascinating is how the country adapts to the changing climate. For instance, Kiribati has been experiencing rising sea levels, which has led to saltwater contamination of freshwater sources.
Oh, yes. That's a crucial issue. I've read that the government is working on measures to protect its freshwater resources, such as building seawalls and desalination plants. I'm certain that our listeners living in Kiribati would agree that this is a top priority.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the government. The people of Kiribati are also taking action. I've seen videos of communities coming together to build their own seawalls and protect their homes from flooding. It's heartening to see that even in the face of adversity, the resilience of the Kiribati people shines through.
That's so true. I've also noticed that Kiribati's climate is characterized by high humidity and frequent rain showers. Can you imagine living in a place where the average annual rainfall is over 100 inches?
Yes, I can imagine. And I think that's one of the reasons why Kiribati is so lush and green. The rainforests are teeming with life, and the coral reefs are some of the most pristine in the world.
That's wonderful. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique features of Kiribati's climate. So, let's compare it to Tajikistan, which has a more continental climate with cold winters and hot summers.
Ah, what a contrast. Tajikistan's climate is quite harsh, with temperatures often dropping below freezing in the winter months. But what's interesting is how the country's geography plays a role in shaping its climate. The Pamir Mountains create a rain-shadow effect, resulting in a dry and arid climate in the western part of the country.
Well, that's fascinating. I didn't know that the mountains had such a significant impact on Tajikistan's climate. And I'm curious, Leo, have you ever experienced a cold winter in Tajikistan?
Well, I've been there during the spring, but I've heard that the winters can be quite brutal. I'm sure it's not for the faint of heart.
I can imagine. But what about the summer months in Tajikistan? I've heard that they can be quite hot and dry.
Yes, that's true. The summers can be quite sweltering, especially in the western part of the country. But what's interesting is how the people of Tajikistan adapt to these extreme temperatures. They have a rich tradition of building houses with thick walls and small windows to keep the heat out.
I see. That makes sense. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the unique features of Tajikistan's climate. So, let's talk about the impact of climate change on both countries.
A very timely topic. Both Kiribati and Tajikistan are vulnerable to the effects of climate change, from rising sea levels to changes in precipitation patterns. But what's interesting is how the two countries are responding to these challenges in different ways.
That's right. Kiribati is taking a proactive approach, with the government working on implementing measures to protect its freshwater resources and build seawalls to protect against flooding. But in Tajikistan, the government is also taking steps to address the impacts of climate change, such as building infrastructure to manage flood risk and implementing policies to promote sustainable land use.
Exactly. And it's not just about the government. The people of both countries are also taking action. In Kiribati, communities are coming together to build their own seawalls and protect their homes from flooding. While in Tajikistan, farmers are adapting to changing weather patterns by using drought-resistant crops and implementing more efficient irrigation systems.
That's so inspiring. I think our listeners would agree that it's heartening to see both countries taking proactive steps to address the impacts of climate change.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there is always hope for a better future.
And to dive into the fascinating world of food culture and nutritional alternatives in Kiribati and Tajikistan, from traditional dishes to innovative solutions. These countries offer a unique blend of flavors and dietary diversity.
That's right. Mira, Kiribati, with its Pacific Island cuisine, is all about fresh seafood and coconut-based dishes. Meanwhile, Tajikistan, nestled in the heart of Central Asia, boasts a rich culinary heritage with influences from Persian, Russian, and Chinese cuisines.
The diversity of flavors is simply amazing. In Kiribati, I've heard that the traditional dish, Ikayafaye, is a must-try. It's a raw fish dish served with coconut cream and lime juice. Have you ever tried anything like that? Leo?
Well, I'm not sure I'm ready to try raw fish just yet. Mira, but I've heard that the seafood in Kiribati is incredibly fresh and delicious. In Tajikistan, on the other hand, I've had the pleasure of trying some amazing PLOV, a traditional rice dish made with meat and spices.
PLOV sounds amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the traditional dishes in these countries. Do you think our listeners living in Kiribati and Tajikistan would agree that these dishes are a staple in their cuisine?
Absolutely. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would agree that traditional dishes like IKI, FAI, and PLOV are a big part of their culinary heritage. And it's not just about the taste, but also about the cultural significance and the stories behind these dishes.
That's so true. Food is a universal language, and it brings people together. I've heard that in Kiribati, the traditional method of cooking is over an open flame, which adds a smoky flavor to the dishes. Can you imagine cooking over an open flame in the middle of the jungle?
I can imagine it. Mira, I'm sure it's a unique experience. In Tajikistan, they also have a traditional method of cooking called the kaname, which is a clay oven that's used to cook bread and other dishes.
The kaname sounds fascinating. I'm sure it's a lot of work to maintain, but the end result must be worth it. Speaking of bread, I've heard that in Tajikistan, the traditional bread, known as naan, is a staple in every household.
That's right. Mira, naan is a delicious flatbread that's made from wheat flour and water. It's often served with tea or used to scoop up stews and soups.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the traditional bread in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Can you tell us a bit more about the bread in these countries? Leah?
Well, Mira, in Kiribati, the traditional bread is called Defai Kaka, which is a type of flatbread made from taro and coconut milk. It's a bit denser than the naan in Tajikistan, but it's equally delicious.
FAI coca sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. And speaking of trying new foods, I've heard that in Kiribati, there's a growing trend towards adopting a plant-based diet. Is that something that's also happening in Tajikistan? Leah?
Yes. Mira, in Tajikistan, there's a growing interest in plant-based diets, particularly among the younger generation. They're looking for healthier alternatives to traditional meat-based dishes.
That's great to hear. Leah, I'm sure our listeners would be interested in learning more about the plant-based options in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Can you tell us a bit more about the plant-based trend in these countries?
Well, Mira, in Kiribati, there's a growing focus on using locally sourced ingredients on reducing food waste. They're also experimenting with new plant-based ingredients, such as tofu and tempeh.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the plant-based trend in these countries. And speaking of reducing food waste, I've heard that in Tajikistan, there's a program to reduce food waste in schools. Is that something that's also happening in Kiribati? Leah?
Yes. Mira, in Kiribati, there's a similar program to reduce food waste in schools, which includes educating students about the importance of reducing food waste and using locally sourced ingredients.
That's great to hear. Leo? I'm sure our listeners would be interested in learning more about the initiatives to reduce food waste in Kiribati and Tajikistan. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners, do you think that the food culture and nutritional alternatives in Kiribati and Tajikistan are unique and worth exploring?
Absolutely. Mira, I think our listeners would agree that the food culture and nutritional alternatives in these countries are not only unique but also worth exploring. And who knows, maybe our listeners will even try some of the traditional dishes we discussed today.
Well, there you have it, folks. Food, culture, and nutritional alternatives in Kiribati and Tajikistan. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation and learned something new about these fascinating countries. And don't forget to share your thoughts and experiences with us in the comments. I'm so to dive into the historical, cultural, and artistic values of Kiribati and Tajikistan. Both countries have such rich heritages, and I'm curious to see how they compare. Jet off. AL's uncovering stories like this. And so do we.
Kiribati first. This tiny island nation in the Pacific has an incredible history of resilience and adaptation. From ancient navigation to modern-day climate change, Kiribati's people have shown remarkable strength.
That's so true. Leo! And speaking of ancient navigation, have you heard about the Kiribati people's expertise in wayfinding? They used to navigate the vast Pacific using only the stars, winds, and currents. It's like they had their own built-in GPS system.
That's amazing. And I've heard that the Kiribati people also have a deep connection to the ocean and its rhythms. They believe in the concept of Tikai, which roughly translates to the sea as a mother. It's a beautiful way to connect with nature.
Exactly. And it's not just the people of Kiribati who have a deep respect for the ocean. The country itself is home to some of the most incredible marine biodiversity in the world. From coral reefs to sea turtles, Kiribati's waters are a treasure trove of marine life.
Wow, that's incredible. And while Kiribati is all about the ocean, Tajikistan is all about the mountains. The Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan are some of the most breathtaking landscapes on the planet. Have you seen the pictures, Mira?
Oh, yes. I've seen them. And they're stunning. But what I find fascinating is the way that people of Tajikistan have adapted to living in such a rugged environment. They've developed their own unique traditions and customs that are deeply connected to the land.
That's so true. And I've heard that the Tajik people have a rich tradition of folk music and dance. They have these incredible instruments like the tambur and the dut, which are played during traditional celebrations and ceremonies.
That sounds amazing. And I'm curious to know more about the cultural exchange between Kiribati and Tajikistan. Have you heard about any collaborations or joint projects between the two countries?
Actually, I've heard that there are some efforts to promote cultural exchange between Kiribati and Tajikistan, particularly in the areas of music and dance. Perhaps we can learn from each other's traditions and create something new and exciting together.
I love this idea. Leo, and speaking of new and exciting, I'm curious to know more about the art scene in both countries. What's the current state of the art world in Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Well, in Kiribati, there's a growing interest in traditional crafts, like wood carving and basket weaving. And in Tajikistan, there's a thriving scene of contemporary art, with many local artists experimenting with new forms and mediums.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the art scene in both countries. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments, and we'll do our best to provide more information.
I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say about this. And speaking of art, I've heard that Kiribati has a unique tradition of storytelling through dance. The Kiribati people have a rich oral tradition that's passed down through generations.
That's so true. And I've heard that the Tajik people also have a strong tradition of storytelling, particularly through folk tales and myth. They have these incredible stories about magical creatures and heroes that are still told and retold today.
Exactly. And I think it's this shared love of storytelling that can bring us closer together, even across cultures and continents. Perhaps we can learn from each other's traditions and create something new and exciting together.
I couldn't agree more. Leo! And speaking of shared love, I'm curious to know more about the shared cultural heritage between Kiribati and Tajikistan. Are there any commonalities or similarities between the two countries?
Well, while Kiribati and Tajikistan may seem worlds apart, they do share some commonalities. Both countries have a strong tradition of hospitality and welcoming guests. And both countries have a deep respect for their elders and traditional customs.
That's so true. And I think it's this shared sense of community and respect that can bring us closer together. Perhaps we can learn from each other's strengths and weaknesses and create a more harmonious world together.
I love that idea. Mira, and speaking of harmony, I've heard that the people of Kiribati have a unique tradition of singing and chanting. They have these incredible songs that are passed down through generations.
That's so beautiful. And I've heard that the Tajik people also have a rich tradition of music and dance. They have these incredible instruments like the tambur and the dut that are played during traditional celebrations and ceremonies.
Exactly. And I think it's this shared love of music and dance that can bring us closer together, even across cultures and continents. Perhaps we can learn from each other's traditions and create something new and exciting together.
I couldn't agree more. Leo, and speaking of new and exciting, I'm curious to know more about the historical sites and landmarks in both countries. What are some of the must-see attractions in Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Well, in Kiribati, there's the incredible Kiribati National Museum, which showcases the country's rich cultural heritage. And in Tajikistan, there's the stunning Pamir Mountains, which offer breathtaking views and opportunities for trekking and hiking.
That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the historical sites and landmarks in both countries. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments, and we'll do our best to provide more information.
I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say about this. And speaking of history, I've heard that Kiribati has a unique tradition of storytelling through oral history. The Kiribati people have a rich oral tradition that's passed down through generations.
That's so true. And I've heard that the Tajik people also have a strong tradition of storytelling, particularly through folk tales and myths. They have these incredible stories about magical creatures and heroes that are still told and retold today.
Exactly. And I think it's this shared love of storytelling that can bring us closer together, even across cultures and continents. Perhaps we can learn from each other's traditions and create something new and exciting together.
I couldn't agree more. Leo, and speaking of shared love, I'm curious to know more about the shared cultural heritage between Kiribati and Tajikistan. Are there any commonalities? So, let's talk about Kiribati and its stunning natural beauty. Who here has been to the Pacific Islands before? I'm curious to know what our listeners think about this country's unique landscapes.
Ah, yes. The Pacific Islands are a treasure trove of natural wonders. Kiribati, in particular, boasts some of the most beautiful atolls and coral reefs in the world. I've always been fascinated by the fact that it's one of the few countries that's still relatively untouched by mass tourism.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Kiribati so special. It's like a hidden gem, waiting to be discovered. But, of course, that also means that it's a bit more challenging to get there. Have you ever tried to plan a trip to Kiribati?
Well, I have tried, but let's just say it's not exactly a straightforward process. The flights can be quite expensive, and the logistics of getting around the islands can be a bit tricky. But trust me, it's worth it. The scenery is just breathtaking.
I completely agree. And I think one of the things that's really unique about Kiribati is its marine life. The coral reefs are some of the most diverse and healthy in the world. And the fish populations are just incredible. Have you ever gone snorkeling or diving in Kiribati?
Oh, yes. I have had the privilege of snorkeling in the coral reefs of Kiribati, and it was truly an unforgettable experience. The clarity of the water and the colors of the coral and fish are just stunning. And the best part is, the marine life is still relatively untouched, so you can see all sorts of rare and exotic species.
That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. So, let's talk about Tajikistan, the second country we're comparing today. What do you know about Tajikistan's natural beauty? Leah?
Well, I must say, Tajikistan is a bit of a surprise when it comes to natural beauty. People often think of it as a mountainous country. And it's true. It does have some of the most stunning mountain ranges in the world. But what's really unique about Tajikistan is its high-altitude lakes, like Lake Saras, which is one of the highest lakes in the world.
Well, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. So, let's talk about what makes Tajikistan's natural beauty so unique. Is it the mountains, the lakes, or something else entirely?
I think it's a combination of all three, actually. The mountains provide a dramatic backdrop to the landscape, and the lakes add a touch of serenity and beauty. But what really sets Tajikistan apart is its unique ecosystems. The country is home to some of the rarest and most endangered species in the world, like the snow leopard and the markhor.
That's fascinating. And I think it's great that our listeners can learn more about these unique ecosystems. So, let's talk about what our listeners can do to experience the natural beauty of Kiribati and Tajikistan. Are there any specific activities or destinations that you would recommend? Leo?
Yes. For Kiribati, I would recommend visiting the capital island, Tarawa, and exploring the coral reefs and marine life. And for Tajikistan, I would recommend visiting the Fann Mountains and hiking to the top of Mount Ilay, which offers breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape.
That sounds like a great plan, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. So, let's wrap up this section and move on to the next one. But before we go, I just want to say that I'm curious to know what our listeners think about the natural beauty of Kiribati and Tajikistan. Do you have any favorite destinations or activities that you would recommend?
Yes. I think it's great that our listeners are interested in learning more about these countries, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss it further in future episodes. But for now, let's just say that both Kiribati and Tajikistan are truly unique and special countries that offer a wealth of natural beauty and adventure opportunities.
So, let's talk about sports, activity, and adventure options in Kiribati, and to share some of the unique experiences you can have on this beautiful island nation.
Yes. Kiribati is definitely a hidden gem when it comes to outdoor activities. I've heard their crystal clear waters are perfect for snorkeling and diving.
That's right, Leo. And it's not just the ocean that's an adventure waiting to happen. The island's rugged terrain and coral reefs make it a paradise for hikers and explorers.
I can imagine. I've seen some amazing photos of the island's scenic landscapes. But what about sports? Mira, what kind of sports are popular in Kiribati?
Well, they have a strong focus on traditional sports like sailing and fishing. In fact, the Kiribati team has competed in several Pacific Games.
That's cool. I didn't know that. And what about adventure activities? Are there any options for thrill seekers like myself?
Yes. Kiribati offers a range of adventure activities, including jet skiing and even shark diving. Just be sure to follow the safety guidelines. Leo.
Don't worry. I will. I'm always careful when it comes to adventure activities. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the local culture? How do the Kiribati people approach sports and adventure?
That's a great question. Leo. In Kiribati, sports and adventure are not just about competition or thrill-seeking, but about community and connection. For example, their traditional sailing competitions are often held during cultural festivals and are a great way to bring people together.
I see what you mean. It's not just about winning or losing, but about sharing experiences and building relationships. That's really beautiful. Mira.
Exactly. And it's something that I think we can all learn from. Now, let's move on to Tajikistan and see how their sports and adventure scene compares.
Yes. Tajikistan is a fascinating country with a rich history and culture. And when it comes to sports and adventure, they have a lot to offer.
That's right. Tajikistan is home to some of the world's most beautiful mountain ranges, including the Pamir Mountains, and the country has a strong focus on winter sports, including skiing and snowboarding.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I've always wanted to try my hand at skiing in the Pamir Mountains. And what about adventure activities? Mira, what kind of options are there for thrill seekers?
Yes. Tajikistan offers a range of adventure activities, including trekking, mountain biking, and even rafting. And for the more adventurous types, there's even the option to try canyoning or rock climbing.
You're making me want to book a ticket to Tajikistan right now. Mira, but seriously, what about the local culture? How do the Tajik people approach sports and adventure?
That's a great question. Leo, in Tajikistan, sports and adventure are not just about competition or thrill seeking, but also about community and connection. For example, their traditional horse riding competitions are often held during cultural festivals and are a great way to bring people together.
I see what you mean. It's not just about winning or losing, but about sharing experiences and building relationships. That's really beautiful. Mira.
Exactly. And it's something that I think we can all learn from. Now, I'm curious. Leo, what do you think our listeners would say about the sports and adventure options in Kiribati and Tajikistan?
I think they would say that both countries offer unique and exciting experiences that are definitely worth exploring. And I'm sure they would agree that the local culture and community are just as important as the sports and adventure activities themselves.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would also agree that both Kiribati and Tajikistan are destinations that offer a true adventure of a lifetime. I'm sure our listeners would love to know about the nightlife in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Let's start with Kiribati. From what I researched, the nightlife scene is pretty laid back, with a focus on traditional music and dance.
That's right. Mira, I've heard that the locals love to gather around the radio and listen to traditional music, especially during holidays and special events. It's a great way to bring the community together.
I can imagine. In Kiribati, I've read that the capital city of Tarawa has a few bars and clubs, but they're not as lively as you find in other countries. It's more about enjoying the local culture and food.
That's true. And I think that's what makes Kiribati's nightlife so unique. It's not about the loud music and crowded clubs, but about the people and the culture. And, of course, the delicious seafood.
Yes, the seafood is amazing in Kiribati. But let's move on to Tajikistan. I've heard that their nightlife scene is a bit more vibrant, with a mix of traditional and modern music.
That's right. In Dushanbe, the capital city, you can find some great bars and clubs that play a mix of traditional and modern music. And, of course, there's the famous Fidra VSI Monument, which is a great place to watch the sunset and enjoy the local culture.
I've read that the Fidra VSI Monument is a beautiful spot, especially at night when it's all lit up. But I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to a traditional Tajikistan wedding?
Actually, yes, I have. It was an amazing experience, with traditional music and dancing. And, of course, delicious food. And, let me tell you, the dancing is quite energetic.
I can imagine. I've read that traditional Tajikistan weddings can last for days, with music and dancing going on late into the night.
That's right. And it's not just the weddings that are lively, but also the everyday life in Tajikistan. People love to gather and socialize, and the nightlife scene reflects that.
I think that's what I love about both Kiribati and Tajikistan, the emphasis on community and culture. And, of course, the delicious food.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners would agree with me that the nightlife scenes in both countries are definitely worth experiencing.
I'm curious, have any of our listeners experienced the nightlife in Kiribati or Tajikistan? If so, please share your stories with us in the comments below.
And if you think we're wrong about the nightlife scenes in these countries, please let us know. We'd love to hear your opinions.
And, of course, if you're planning a trip to either of these countries, be sure to check out our previous episodes on travel tips and cultural insights.
Thanks for joining us on this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.
I'm to dive into family-friendly environments and children's activities in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Who wouldn't want to explore the beauty of these two countries through the eyes of kids? Let's start with Kiribati, where the laid-back atmosphere and stunning beaches create a perfect playground for families. Have you ever been to Kiribati, Leah?
Actually, Mira, I haven't had the chance to visit Kiribati yet, but I've heard great things about its family-friendly vibe. From what I know, the Kiribati people are known for their warm hospitality, which makes it easy for tourists to feel at home. I'm curious, what's the most family-friendly activity you'd recommend in Kiribati?
That's a great question. I think one of the most unique experiences for kids is the traditional Kiribati fishing trip. It's not only an adventure, but also a great way to learn about the local culture and the importance of fishing in the Kiribati community. Have you ever gone on a fishing trip with your family? Leo?
Yes, I have. And I must say, it was a blast. But I'm not sure if it's suitable for all ages, especially young children. In Tajikistan, I've heard that the country's natural beauty and outdoor activities are perfect for families. Can you tell me more about that? Mira?
Absolutely. Tajikistan has some of the most breathtaking mountain scenery in the world, and its national parks offer plenty of opportunities for hiking and trekking. But what I think is especially great for families is the traditional Tajik cuisine, which is all about sharing food and storytelling. I'm sure our listeners would agree that food is a big part of family bonding, right?
That's so true. Mira, food is a great way to bring people together. In Tajikistan, I've heard that the traditional dish, POV, is a staple of family meals. Have you tried POV, Mira?
Oh, yes. I've had PLOV in Tajikistan, and it's delicious. But what I think is even more interesting is the way families in Kiribati and Tajikistan come together to celebrate special occasions. In Kiribati, the traditional dance, the tika, is a big part of cultural celebrations. Can you tell me more about that? Leo?
Ah, yes. The Tikoa is a traditional Kiribati dance that's performed during special occasions like weddings and birthdays. It's a beautiful display of cultural heritage and community spirit. In Tajikistan, I've heard that the traditional music and dance, the Tano VAR, is also an important part of family celebrations.
That's so cool. I think it's great that both countries have such a strong emphasis on cultural heritage and community spirit. If you're planning a trip to either country with your family, I highly recommend checking out the local festivals and events. Who knows, you might even learn some traditional dances or music.
I think that's a great idea, Mira. And speaking of learning new things, I've heard that both countries have great programs for kids to learn about their cultural heritage. Can you tell me more about that, Mira?
Yes. In Kiribati, there are programs like the Kiribati Cultural Center that offer workshops and classes for kids to learn about their cultural heritage. Similarly, in Tajikistan, there are programs like the Tajikistan Cultural Institute that offer classes and workshops for kids to learn about their cultural heritage.
That's fantastic. I think it's great that both countries are investing in programs that promote cultural, heritage, and education for kids. If you're a parent or guardian planning a trip to either country with your kids, I highly recommend checking out these programs. Who knows? You might even learn something new yourself.
I think that's a great idea. Leo, and speaking of learning, I'm curious about what our listeners think about family-friendly environments and children's activities in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations? Dear listeners,
Yes. I'm sure our listeners have plenty of thoughts and recommendations. Let's keep the conversation going and hear from them in the comments section. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
I'm so to talk about LGBT-friendly atmospheres in Kiribati and Tajikistan. You know, I was reading about Kiribati's history, and it's amazing how the government has been working to create a more inclusive environment for the LGBT community.
Yes. And what's the most LGBT-friendly country in the world? But, seriously, Kiribati has made some great strides in recognizing and protecting the rights of its LGBT citizens.
Exactly. And it's not just the government. The community itself has been quite proactive in advocating for their rights. I mean, have you heard about the Kiribati Pride event?
No. Tell me more. I'm curious. And by the way, I'm sure our listeners are wondering if we'll be talking about the food in these countries too.
Well, maybe a little bit later. Leo. But for now, let's focus on the LGBT-friendly atmosphere. So, the Kiribati Pride event is actually a relatively new phenomenon. But it's been gaining momentum, especially among the younger generation.
That's amazing. I'm sure it's not easy to organize a pride event in a small island nation like Kiribati, but I'm sure it's worth it to see the community come together and celebrate their identity.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the Pride event. The community is also working to create a more inclusive environment in schools and workplaces. I mean, can you imagine having to hide who you are just to fit in?
No way. Mira, it's just not right. But I'm sure Kiribati is making progress, and we should be celebrating that.
Exactly. And speaking of progress, let's talk about Tajikistan. I've heard that the country has a relatively conservative history, but there are still efforts being made to create a more inclusive environment for the LGBT community.
Yes. And what's the biggest challenge facing the LGBT community in Tajikistan? Is it the government, the culture, or something else entirely?
Well, it's definitely a combination of all three. But I think the biggest challenge is the lack of awareness and understanding about LGBT issues. I mean, I mean, can you imagine not knowing anyone who is LGBT in your community?
No way. Mira, that's just not something I can even imagine. But I'm sure there are people in Tajikistan who are working hard to change that.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the LGBT community. It's about creating a more inclusive environment for everyone. I mean, can you imagine living in a country where you can be yourself without fear of persecution?
That's the dream, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners are wondering what they can do to support the LGBT community in these countries.
Well, first of all, let's just spread awareness about the issues facing the LGBT community in these countries. And if you're living in Kiribati or Tajikistan, please, please get involved in the community and help make a difference.
And if you're not living in these countries, but you're passionate about LGBT rights, please consider volunteering or donating to organizations that support these communities.
Exactly. And let's not forget to celebrate the progress that's being made in these countries. I mean, Kiribati may not have the most liberal laws, but the community is still pushing forward and demanding their rights.
And Tajikistan may have a conservative culture, but there are still people working hard to create a more inclusive environment. So, let's give it up for the LGBT community in Kiribati and Tajikistan.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, Leo. But I'm sure our listeners have even more questions and comments.
Absolutely. And we'd love to hear from you. Please leave your comments in the section below, and we'll be sure to respond.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content like this.
And maybe we'll even do a video on the food in Kiribati and Tajikistan.
Leo, you're always about food.
Hey, someone's got to represent the culinary side of things.
Well, I think we've covered enough ground for today. Thanks for tuning in. Everyone, I'm curious. Have you ever been to Kiribati? Leah? I've heard their hospitality is unmatched. They welcome visitors with open arms and warm.
Actually, I have been to Kiribati. Mira, it's a tiny island nation in the Pacific, and their people are indeed incredibly friendly. But what struck me was their emphasis on shared meals and communal living. It's not just about welcoming guests. It's about sharing their way of life.
That's fascinating. I can imagine sharing a meal with the locals and learning about their customs. In Kiribati, it's customary to share food and drinks with your visitors, and they often offer their homes as guest houses. It's like they're saying, "Come, stay with us, and we'll share our lives with you."
Exactly. And it's not just about the food or the accommodations. The people of Kiribati are known for their warmth and generosity. They'll often invite you to join in on their daily activities, like fishing or cooking, and make you feel like part of the family.
I can see why you fall in love with that kind of hospitality. Leah, and it's not just limited to the islands. In Kiribati, the concept of IBU, or hospitality, is deeply ingrained in their culture. They believe that offering hospitality to strangers is a way of showing respect and kindness.
That's beautiful, Mira. And it's interesting to compare that with the hospitality in Tajikistan, which is our next country. While Kiribati is known for its warm and welcoming people, Tajikistan has a more complex history when it comes to foreign relations.
Yes, Tajikistan has a rich cultural heritage, and their people are known for their resilience and hospitality. However, due to their history and geography, they've had to navigate complex relationships with neighboring countries and global powers. But, as we've seen in Kiribati, hospitality is often a way of bridging cultural gaps and building connections.
Exactly. And in Tajikistan, we see a similar emphasis on shared meals and communal living. In fact, the traditional Tajik dish, PLOV, is often served at social gatherings and is a symbol of hospitality and generosity.
That's a great example. Leo. And it's not just about the food. It's about the way people come together to share in the experience. In Tajikistan, the concept of taravat or hospitality is deeply rooted in their culture, and it's often seen as a way of showing respect and kindness to guests.
I'm curious, Mira, have you noticed any differences in the way hospitality is practiced in Kiribati and Tajikistan? For example, in Kiribati, it's common for guests to be invited to join in on daily activities, while in Tajikistan, it's more formal and reserved.
Ah, that's a great observation. Leo, while both countries value hospitality, the way it's practiced is indeed different. In Kiribati, it's more informal and spontaneous, while in Tajikistan, it's more formal and structured. But, as we've seen, both countries place a high value on sharing meals and communal living.
That's true. And it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong emphasis on community and social bonds. In Kiribati, the concept of KLU or community is central to their culture, while in Tajikistan, the concept of Makh Mali or community is also deeply ingrained.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Leo, have you noticed any differences in the way hospitality is practiced in different countries? And how do you think we can learn from these cultural practices?
That's a great question. Mira, I think one of the key takeaways from our conversation is that hospitality is not just about welcoming guests. It's about building connections and fostering community. And in both Kiribati and Tajikistan, we see a strong emphasis on shared meals and communal living.
That's a great point. And it's not just limited to these two countries. As we've seen, hospitality is a universal value that can be practiced in many different ways. So, let's hear from our listeners. How do you practice hospitality in your daily life? And what do you think are some key takeaways from our conversation today?
I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners will have some valuable insights to share. Thank you for joining us on this podcast, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
So, let's talk about internet infrastructure and digital facilities in Kiribati and Tajikistan. I'm to dive into the world of tech in these two countries.
Yes, because who doesn't love a good tech adventure? Kiribati, being one of the smallest countries in the world, has surprisingly made great strides in digital connectivity.
I know, right? And Tajikistan, with its rugged terrain, has had to innovate in the field of digital infrastructure. Let's start with Kiribati. What do you think is the most impressive aspect of their internet infrastructure?
Well, for a country with such a small population, Kiribati has invested heavily in satellite-based internet services. This has enabled them to connect with the world in a way that's quite impressive.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about how this works. Leo, can you explain it in a way that's easy to understand?
Sure. Imagine having a giant satellite hovering above your head, beaming down internet signals like a digital angel.
That's a great analogy. But seriously, how does it work in practice?
Well, Kiribati has partnered with a few international companies to provide satellite-based internet services. This allows them to bypass the need for undersea cables, which would be impractical in their case.
I see. And what about Tajikistan? How has their internet infrastructure developed over the years?
Tajikistan has made significant strides in recent years, thanks to a government-led initiative to improve digital connectivity. They've invested in fiber optic cables and upgraded their network infrastructure.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners are curious about the impact of this on the local economy and daily life. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's done. Improved internet connectivity has opened up new opportunities for businesses and entrepreneurs in Tajikistan. They can now access global markets and connect with customers more easily.
That's really exciting. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the challenges faced by these countries in terms of digital infrastructure. What do you think are some of the biggest hurdles they face?
Ah, that's a great question. One of the biggest challenges faced by both countries is the high cost of internet services. This can be a barrier for many people, especially in rural areas.
I completely agree. And what about the issue of digital literacy? How do these countries address the need for people to have the skills and knowledge to use technology effectively?
Ah, that's a great point. Both countries have initiatives in place to promote digital literacy and provide training programs for people.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the role of technology in these countries. Can you tell us more about how technology is being used in Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Well, in Kiribati, technology is being used in a range of areas, from education to healthcare. They're also using it to promote sustainable fishing practices and protect their marine environment.
That's really inspiring. And what about Tajikistan? How is technology being used in their country?
In Tajikistan, technology is being used to improve agriculture and increase crop yields. They're also using it to promote tourism and showcase their cultural heritage.
That's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the future of internet infrastructure and digital facilities in these countries. What do you think the future holds for Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Well, I think both countries will continue to make significant strides in digital connectivity. They'll also need to address the challenges of digital security and data protection.
That's a great point. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the role of the private sector in supporting digital development in these countries. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. The private sector has a crucial role to play in supporting digital development in Kiribati and Tajikistan. They're investing in infrastructure and providing services that are essential for digital connectivity.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the impact of digitalization on the local culture and way of life. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, digitalization has had a significant impact on the local culture and way of life in both countries. It's opened up new opportunities for people to connect with the world and access information and services.
That's really fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the challenges faced by these countries in terms of digitalization. What do you think are some of the biggest hurdles they face?
That's a great question. One of the biggest challenges faced by both countries is the need to balance the benefits of digitalization with the potential risks and challenges.
I completely agree. And what about the issue of digital inclusion? How do these countries ensure that everyone has access to digital services and technologies?
That's a great point. Both countries have initiatives in place to promote digital inclusion and provide access to digital services for marginalized communities.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the future of digitalization in these countries. What do you think the future holds for Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Well, I think both countries will continue to make significant strides in digitalization. They'll also need to address the challenges of digital security and data protection.
That's a great point. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the role of the government in supporting digital development in these countries. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. The government has a crucial role to play in supporting digital development in Kiribati and Tajikistan. They're investing in infrastructure and providing policies that support digital growth.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the impact of digitalization on the local economy. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, digitalization has had a significant impact on the local economy in both countries. It's opened up new opportunities for businesses and entrepreneurs to connect with the world and access global markets.
That's really exciting. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the challenges faced by these countries in terms of digitalization. What do you think are some of the biggest hurdles they face?
That's a great question. One of the biggest challenges faced by both countries is the need to balance the benefits of digitalization with the potential risks and challenges.
I completely agree. And what about the issue of digital security? How do these countries protect themselves from cyber threats and data breaches?
Ah, that's a great point. Both countries have initiatives in place to promote digital security and protect against cyber threats.
I'm certain our listeners living in Kiribati would agree with me that shopping opportunities are limited. But what they lack in variety, they make up for in authenticity. You can find everything from fresh seafood to handmade crafts in their bustling markets.
That's true. But have you ever tried finding a decent pair of shoes in Kiribati? I once had to buy a pair of flip-flops from a local vendor, and let's just say they were interesting.
Well, I think that's the charm of shopping in Kiribati. It's all about embracing the local culture and finding unique treasures. And who knows, you might just discover a new favorite pair of flip-flops.
I suppose that's one way to look at it. But seriously, have you ever tried comparing prices in Kiribati to those in Tajikistan? I think our listeners would be by the differences.
Actually, I've done some research on that, and it seems that Tajikistan has a more developed retail sector, with a wider range of products available. But what about the quality of those products? I'm not sure if it's worth the extra cost.
That's a great point. Mira, in Tajikistan, you can find everything from high-end designer clothing to local handicrafts. But the prices can be steep. I've heard that some tourists have even been taken advantage of by unscrupulous vendors.
Oh no, that's terrible. I'm sure our listeners would agree that's not the kind of shopping experience anyone wants. But what about the markets in Tajikistan? I've heard they're filled with colorful stalls selling everything from fresh produce to handicrafts.
Yes, the markets in Tajikistan are definitely a highlight of the shopping scene. But have you ever tried navigating the crowds and haggling with vendors? It's an experience unlike any other. That's for sure.
I can only imagine. But seriously, Leo, I think our listeners would love to hear more about the shopping opportunities in Tajikistan. Can you tell us more about the local markets and what kinds of products you can find there?
Of course. Yeah. The markets in Tajikistan are a treasure trove of local products, from handmade carpets to intricately embroidered clothing. And the prices? Well, let's just say you can find some great deals on quality products.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the shopping scene in Tajikistan. And what about the price-performance balance? Is it worth the cost to shop in Tajikistan?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, while the prices in Tajikistan may be higher than in Kiribati, the quality of the products is often superior. And let's not forget the unique shopping experience you get in the markets. It's an experience you won't find anywhere else.
I completely agree. Leah, and I think our listeners would agree with us that shopping in Tajikistan is definitely worth the experience. But what about our listeners living in Kiribati? Don't they deserve some shopping opportunities too?
Of course, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners in Kiribati would love to know about the shopping scene in their own country. Perhaps we can explore some of the local markets and handicrafts in our next episode.
That sounds like a great idea. Leo! And who knows? Maybe we can even find some unique shopping opportunities in Kiribati that will rival those in Tajikistan.
I wouldn't count on it. Mira, but seriously, I think our listeners would love to hear more about the shopping scene in Kiribati. And who knows? Maybe we can even discover some hidden gems in the process.
I'm sure our listeners would love that. Leo, and I think we've covered enough about shopping opportunities and price-performance balance in both countries. But before we go, let's ask our listeners what are your favorite shopping experiences in Kiribati and Tajikistan? Do you have any tips for our listeners who are planning to shop in either country?
That's a great question. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to share their experiences and tips with us. So let's hear from you in the comments below.
I'm telling you, Leo, Kiribati has the most unique cultural events, especially during the Pacific Islands Festival. The traditional dances, the music, and the food, it's a sensory overload in the best possible way.
Ah, but have you considered Tajikistan's Navruzi celebrations? It's a UNESCO recognized festival that marks the spring equinox, and it's a real spectacle. The decorations, the music, and the food, it's a feast for the senses.
I love how both countries have these incredible cultural events. But in Kiribati, the festival is more about community and coming together. It's a time for the locals to showcase their talents and share their traditions with the world.
That's true. But in Tajikistan, Navruzi is more of a national celebration. It's a time for families to reunite and for the country to come together in a shared experience. And the traditions are just incredible, the ancient rituals, the music, and the dancing.
I can imagine how amazing it must be to experience Navruzi in Tajikistan. But in Kiribati, we have the Pacific Islands Festival, which is a celebration of the Pacific Island culture. It's a time for the locals to showcase their music, dance, and art, and it's just incredible.
That sounds amazing. Mira, but have you considered the role of music in Tajikistan's culture? The traditional music is just incredible, the singing, the dancing, and the instruments. It's a real treat for the senses.
Actually, I was just reading about the traditional music in Kiribati, and it's fascinating. The music is all about storytelling and sharing the history and culture of the island. It's just incredible to listen to.
I'm sure it is. Lira, but in Tajikistan, the music is more of a national institution. The traditional music is just incredible, the singing, the dancing, and the instruments. And the festivals are just a celebration of that music and culture.
I can see why you'd think that, Leo. But in Kiribati, the music is all about the community. It's a time for the locals to come together and share their music and culture with the world. And the festivals are just a celebration of that community and culture.
I'm sure that's true. Mira, but in Tajikistan, the music is more of a national symbol. The traditional music is just incredible, the singing, the dancing, and the instruments. And the festivals are just a celebration of that music and culture.
I think we're getting a bit off track here. Leo, let's talk about the festivals in Kiribati and Tajikistan. What do you think is the most unique aspect of each festival?
I think the most unique aspect of Kiribati's Pacific Islands Festival is the way it brings the community together. It's a time for the locals to showcase their talents and share their traditions with the world.
I agree, Leo. But in Tajikistan, the Navruzi celebrations are just incredible. The decorations, the music, and the food, it's a feast for the senses. And the traditions are just incredible, the ancient rituals, the music, and the dancing.
I'm sure that's true. Mira, but have you considered the role of Jet-Off in helping us understand these cultural events? These insights could have been possible without Jet-Off by referring to cultural trends.
You're right, Leo. But seriously, I think the most unique aspect of each festival is the way it brings the community together. In Kiribati, it's a time for the locals to come together and share their music and culture with the world. And in Tajikistan, it's a time for families to reunite and for the country to come together in a shared experience.
I think that's a great point, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that these cultural events are just incredible. I mean, who wouldn't want to experience the Pacific Islands Festival in Kiribati or the Navruzi celebrations in Tajikistan?
I'm certain that our listeners living in Kiribati would agree with me that the Pacific Islands Festival is a truly unique experience. And I'm sure our listeners living in Tajikistan would agree with me that the Navruzi celebrations are just incredible.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, Mira, but I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about these cultural events. Do you think they're worth experiencing?
Absolutely. I think these cultural events are just incredible, and they're definitely worth experiencing, and I'm sure our listeners would agree with me.
Well, I think we'll have to agree to disagree. Mira, but I'm sure our listeners will have their own opinions on the matter. And if you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners will have their own opinions, Leo, but I think we can both agree that these cultural events are just incredible, and they're definitely worth experiencing.
Well, I think, Mira, but before we go, let's talk about the food in Kiribati and Tajikistan. What do you think is the most unique aspect of each country's cuisine?
I think the most unique aspect of Kiribati's cuisine is the way it combines traditional Pacific Island flavors with modern influences. It's just incredible to try the local dishes and experience the flavors of the island.
I'm sure that's true, Mira. But in Tajikistan, the cuisine is all about the traditional flavors and ingredients. The plov, the sherpa, and the mandu. It's just incredible to try these traditional dishes and experience the flavors of the country.
I agree. But I think we've covered a lot of ground here. And it's time to wrap up. Thanks for joining me, Leo. And I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation about cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Kiribati and Tajikistan.
Thanks for having me, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners will have enjoyed this conversation about the unique cultural events and festivals in each country.
So, our listeners are probably wondering, how easy is it to learn the local language in Kiribati? Well, I'm curious. Leo, have you had any experience with learning a local language while traveling?
Actually, Mira, I have had some experience with language learning, but I think Kiribati's language, Pilbertse, might be a bit of a challenge even for me. I mean, it's a Polynesian language, and there aren't many resources available for learners.
That's a good point, Leo. But, sometimes the best way to learn a language is to immerse yourself in the culture. And Kiribati is all about community and family. I think it's a great opportunity for learners to get hands-on experience.
I agree, Mira. And it's not just about the language itself, but also the customs and traditions that come with it. I've heard that Kiribati has a rich oral storytelling tradition, which is really unique and fascinating.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that makes Kiribati so special. The people are so warm and welcoming, and they're always eager to share their culture with visitors.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the opportunities for language learning in Kiribati. Has anyone here had any experience with language learning in Kiribati?
Actually, I think our listeners might be interested in hearing about the language schools in Kiribati. From what I've researched, there are several language schools that offer classes in Gilbert, TSC, as well as English.
That's great to hear, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the cultural immersion programs available in Kiribati. Can you tell us more about those?
Yes, of course. The cultural immersion programs in Kiribati are really wonderful. They allow learners to live with local families and participate in daily activities, which is a great way to learn about the culture and language.
I can imagine it would be a really immersive experience. And I'm sure our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the challenges of learning the local language in Kiribati.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is the lack of resources available for learners. But, as I said earlier, immersion is a great way to overcome that challenge.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the opportunities for language learning in Tajikistan, our second country.
Yes. Tajikistan is a great country for language learners, with a rich cultural heritage and a beautiful language. From what I've researched, there are several language schools that offer classes in Tajik, as well as Russian and English.
That's great to hear, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the cultural immersion programs available in Tajikistan.
Yes, of course. The cultural immersion programs in Tajikistan are really wonderful. They allow learners to live with local families and participate in daily activities, which is a great way to learn about the culture and language.
I think our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the challenges of learning the local language in Tajikistan. Can you tell us more about those?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is the complexity of the Tajik language, which has many different dialects and variations.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the opportunities for language learning online, in both Kiribati and Tajikistan.
Yes. There are several online resources available for language learners in both countries, including language learning apps and online courses.
That's great to hear, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the cost of language learning in Kiribati and Tajikistan.
Well, I think the cost of language learning in both countries is relatively low, especially compared to other countries in the region.
That's great to know. Mira, and I think our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the opportunities for language learning in other countries in the region.
Yes. There are several other countries in the region that offer great opportunities for language learning, including Fiji and Samoa.
That's great to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the challenges of language learning in other countries in the region.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is the lack of resources available for learners, as well as the complexity of the languages themselves.
Ah, I see. And I think our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the opportunities for language learning in different contexts, such as business or tourism.
Yes. There are several opportunities for language learning in different contexts, including business and tourism. And I think our listeners would be interested in knowing more about those.
That's a great point. Mira, and I think our listeners would also be interested in knowing about the importance of language learning for personal and professional development.
Yes. Language learning is so important for personal and professional development. And I think our listeners would be interested in knowing more about that.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about the opportunities and challenges of language learning in Kiribati in Tajikistan.
Yes. I think we had a really informative conversation, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the information we've shared.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mira, thanks for joining me on this conversation about language learning in Kiribati in Tajikistan.
Thanks, Leo. It was a pleasure to talk about language learning with you. So, let's dive into the safety and comfort for women travelers in Kiribati. From what I researched, Kiribati is a relatively safe country for women, with low levels of crime and violence. In fact, it's one of the few countries in the world where women can walk around freely without worrying about harassment.
That's great to hear, Mira. But I have to ask, how does Kiribati's laid-back and traditional culture affect women's safety and comfort? Are women expected to behave in a certain way to avoid attention?
Actually, Leo, Kiribati's culture is quite unique. Women are highly respected in Kiribati society, and they're often seen as the guardians of the family and community. This doesn't mean that women are immune to harassment or abuse. In fact, some women have reported experiencing harassment from men in positions of power.
Well, that's surprising. I wouldn't have expected that in a country with such a strong sense of community. Have there been any efforts to address these issues and improve women's safety and comfort?
Yes, Leo. There have been efforts to address these issues. The Kiribati government has implemented laws to protect women from domestic violence and harassment. And there are also community-based initiatives to promote women's rights and empowerment.
That's great to hear. But I'm curious, how do women travelers experience Kiribati's safety and comfort? Have there been any notable incidents or challenges that women have faced while traveling in Kiribati?
Actually, Leo, I've spoken to several women travelers who have visited Kiribati, and they've all reported having a positive experience. One of them did mention that she felt uncomfortable when she was asked invasive questions by local men.
Oh, I can imagine how uncomfortable that would be. But I'm sure that's not unique to Kiribati. Have there been any similar experiences reported by women travelers in Tajikistan, our second country of comparison?
Actually, Leo, Tajikistan is a bit of a different story. While it's a beautiful country with a rich culture, women travelers have reported experiencing harassment and sexism in Tajikistan. In fact, some women have reported being catcalled or even followed by men while walking alone in the streets.
Oh, that's alarming. I'm not sure I would have expected that in a country with such a strong tradition of women's empowerment. Have there been any efforts to address these issues and improve women's safety and comfort in Tajikistan?
Yes, Leo. There have been efforts to address these issues. The Tajik government has implemented laws to protect women's rights, and there are also community-based initiatives to promote women's empowerment and education.
That's great to hear. But I'm curious. How do women travelers experience Tajikistan's safety and comfort? Have there been any notable incidents or challenges that women have faced while traveling in Tajikistan?
Actually, Leo, I've spoken to several women travelers who have visited Tajikistan, and they've all reported having a mixed experience, have reported feeling welcome and respected by the local community, while others have reported experiencing harassment and sexism.
That's interesting. I'm not sure I would have expected such a mixed experience. Have there been any common themes or patterns that emerge from the experiences of women travelers in both Kiribati and Tajikistan?
Actually, Leo, one common theme that emerges is the importance of respecting local customs and traditions. Women travelers who have had positive experiences in both countries have reported being respectful of the local culture and community, and being open to learning and adapting to new situations.
That's great advice. Yeah. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me when I say that safety and comfort for women travelers are essential for promoting women's empowerment and equality. If you have any thoughts or experiences on this topic, please let us know in the comments.
Absolutely. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would also agree with me when I say that women's safety and comfort are not just important for women travelers, but also for the entire community. By promoting women's safety and comfort, we can create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
That's a great point. Mia, and I think that's a great way to wrap up our discussion on safety and comfort for women travelers in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Thanks for sharing your insights and experiences. Mira.
Thanks. Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences and insights on this topic. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm sure our listeners are curious about the legal systems in Kiribati and Tajikistan. Let's dive right in. In Kiribati, the Constitution guarantees individual rights and freedoms, but in practice, there can be some challenges.
Yes. And it's interesting to note that Kiribati's constitution is based on the British model, which is quite different from Tajikistan's Soviet-era roots. But let's not get too caught up in the historical context just yet. What do you think are some of the key issues with individual rights and freedoms in Kiribati?
Well, for one thing, the country has a relatively weak tradition of upholding human rights. There have been cases of police brutality, and the government has been criticized for its handling of dissent. But, of course, this is not unique to Kiribati.
That's true. Both countries have their own unique challenges when it comes to individual rights and freedoms. In Tajikistan, for example, the government has been accused of suppressing free speech and assembly. But, as you mentioned, this is a common issue in many countries.
Exactly. And it's not just about the government's actions, but also about the cultural context. In Kiribati, for instance, there's a strong emphasis on community and social harmony, which can sometimes lead to a reluctance to speak out against the government or challenge the status quo.
I see what you mean. It's like the old saying goes, don't rock the boat, or you might end up in a drink. But, of course, that's not always the best approach. As a comedian, I always say that the best jokes are the ones that make you laugh while also making you think.
Well, I think that's a great approach to comedy, Leo. But, in all seriousness, individual rights and freedoms are essential for any healthy society. And it's interesting to note that both Kiribati and Tajikistan have made some progress in recent years in terms of protecting human rights.
Yes, that's true. And it's always heartening to see governments take steps to improve the human rights situation. But, of course, there's still much work to be done. I'm sure our listeners would agree that individual rights and freedoms are essential for any country to truly thrive.
Absolutely. And I'm curious to hear from our listeners, do you think that Kiribati and Tajikistan have made enough progress in protecting individual rights and freedoms? Let us know in the comments below.
Well, I think we can all agree that there's always room for improvement. But, in the meantime, let's take a look at some of the positive developments in both countries. In Kiribati, for example, there have been efforts to strengthen the independence of the judiciary and improve access to justice.
That's great to hear. Leo, and in Tajikistan. There have been initiatives to promote freedom of the press and protect journalists who are critical of the government. It's always heartening to see governments take steps to promote transparency and accountability.
Ah, yes. And it's not just about the government's actions, but also about the role of civil society. In both countries, there are many brave individuals and organizations working tirelessly to promote human rights and protect individual freedoms.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this topic so fascinating. It's not just about the laws on the books, but also about the people who are working to make a difference on the ground.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. But before we wrap up, I just want to say that I'm curious to hear from our listeners. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing Kiribati and Tajikistan when it comes to individual rights and freedoms? Let us know in the comments below.
Well, I think we've had a great discussion, Leo, and I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say on the topic. Thanks for joining us today to explore the legal systems in Kiribati and Tajikistan. So, let's talk about spa and relaxation in Kiribati and Tajikistan. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever had the chance to unwind in a traditional Kiribati spa?
Mira, I'm all about relaxation. But Kiribati's traditional spas are more like, well, let's just say they're a unique experience. I've heard they use coconut oil and seaweed to soften the skin, but I'm not sure I'd call it a spa in the classical sense.
That's true, but I think it's great that they're using natural resources to promote wellness. And have you heard about the traditional Tajikistan bathhouses? They're called banya, and they're basically a steam room with a sauna and a cold plunge pool.
A cold plunge pool? That sounds like a real challenge. But I've also heard that the banya is a great way to socialize and connect with others. In fact, it's a big part of Tajik culture.
Exactly. And I think that's what's so great about Kiribati's spas too. They're not just about relaxing, but also about connecting with nature and with each other. I've heard that the locals will often invite tourists to join them in the spa, and it's a really special experience.
That sounds amazing. And I have to say, I'm a big fan of trying new things. So, I'm definitely up for a traditional Kiribati spa experience. But what about Tajikistan spas? Are they more modern?
Ah, yes. While traditional banya is still a big part of Tajik culture, there are also some wonderful modern spas in Dushanbe and other cities. They offer all sorts of treatments, from massages to facials, and they're definitely worth checking out.
Wow, I didn't know that. I think I might have to plan a trip to Tajikistan just to try out some of these spas. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it too.
Well, we'll definitely have to do a follow-up episode on Tajikistan spas. But for now, let's talk about what makes Kiribati spas so special. I think it's the combination of traditional practices and natural resources that really sets them apart.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that Kiribati spas are often run by local women, who are the heart and soul of the community. It's a wonderful way to support local businesses and promote women's empowerment.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Kiribati spas often have a strong focus on sustainability and environmental protection. They're using natural resources in a way that's good for the planet. And that's really admirable.
Wow, I didn't know that. I think Kiribati spas are definitely worth checking out. And who knows, maybe we'll even get to try one out ourselves someday.
That would be amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it too. So, let's wrap up this episode by saying that both Kiribati and Tajikistan have wonderful spa and relaxation opportunities, but in different ways.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this podcast so great. We get to explore different cultures and traditions in a way that's fun and informative.
Absolutely. And we'll be back next time with more exciting topics and stories from around the world. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our podcasting adventures.
And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.
And finally, I just want to say that I'm so grateful to be working with Mira on this podcast. She's an amazing partner and friend, and I'm so lucky to have her by my side.
Oh, thanks, Leo. I feel the same way about you. And I'm so grateful to our listeners for joining us on this journey. Thanks again, everyone. And don't forget to stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll be exploring the world of traditional medicine in Kiribati in Tajikistan.
And I'll be trying to remember which country has the better spas.
Hey everyone, let's talk about Kiribati and Tajikistan. Two countries that offer a unique blend of traditional spirituality and modern ways of life. I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that the spiritual landscape is fascinating.
That's right. Near Kiribati, being a Christian majority country, has a strong emphasis on faith and community. The locals are known for their warm hospitality and welcoming nature, which is perfect for spiritual seekers.
And Tajikistan, being a predominantly Muslim country, has a rich cultural heritage that reflects its Islamic roots. The country's history and architecture are a testament to its spiritual traditions.
Yes, and both countries have a strong sense of community and respect for tradition. In Kiribati, the local churches play a vital role in bringing people together, while in Tajikistan, the mosques serve as centers for worship and community gatherings.
Exactly. And it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong emphasis on family and social ties, which is essential for building strong spiritual communities.
Absolutely. In Kiribati, the concept of Tirio, or the language of the land, is deeply connected to the country's spiritual heritage. The language is used to convey spiritual teachings and values.
That's fascinating. And in Tajikistan, the country's rich cultural heritage is reflected in its architecture and art. The stunning mosques and madrasas are a testament to the country's spiritual traditions.
Yes, and both countries have a strong emphasis on education and personal development, which is essential for spiritual growth. In Kiribati, the local schools and churches offer programs to promote spiritual education and personal growth.
And in Tajikistan, the government has implemented programs to promote cultural and spiritual heritage, including the restoration of historic mosques and madrasas.
That's right. And it's heartening to see that both countries are making efforts to preserve their cultural and spiritual heritage for future generations.
I'm curious, Leo, how do you think our listeners living in these countries would describe their spiritual experiences? Do they feel that their faith is an integral part of their daily lives?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think our listeners would say that their faith is deeply connected to their daily lives and is an essential part of their identity.
Exactly. And I'm sure they would also say that their spiritual experiences are shaped by their cultural and historical contexts.
Absolutely. In Kiribati, the local churches play a vital role in promoting spiritual growth and community development, while in Tajikistan, the mosques serve as centers for worship and community gatherings.
And it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong emphasis on interfaith dialogue and cooperation. In Kiribati, the local churches and mosques work together to promote spiritual understanding and cooperation.
That's right. And in Tajikistan, the government has implemented programs to promote interfaith dialogue and cooperation, including the establishment of the Tajikistan Islamic Council.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that interfaith dialogue and cooperation are essential for building strong spiritual communities.
Absolutely. And it's heartening to see that both countries are making efforts to promote spiritual understanding and cooperation.
Well, that's all for now, folks. We hope you enjoyed this segment on the opportunities for religious and spiritual needs in Kiribati and Tajikistan. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on spirituality and culture.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Kiribati would agree with me when I say that cultural diversity is celebrated in this beautiful Pacific island nation. From the Kiribati people's rich traditions to the influence of Christianity and Islam, the country's history is a true melting pot.
Yes. I've heard that the people of Kiribati are incredibly welcoming, and the country's small size allows for a strong sense of community. But, Nira, don't you think that the country's limited resources and geographical isolation can make it challenging to promote social equality and respect for minorities?
Actually, Leo, I think that's a great point. But Kiribati has made significant strides in promoting social equality and respect for minorities. For example, the government has implemented policies to support the rights of women and children, and the country has a strong tradition of community-based initiatives that promote social cohesion.
That's fascinating. I've also heard that Kiribati is a thriving arts scene, with a focus on traditional music and dance. But I'm curious, Mira, how do you think the country's cultural diversity affects its social dynamics? For instance, how do people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds interact with one another?
Ah, excellent question. Leah, in Kiribati, I've observed that people from different backgrounds often come together to celebrate cultural events and traditions. For example, during the annual Kiribati Day celebrations, people from all walks of life gather to share food, music, and dance. It's truly a beautiful display of cultural diversity and social harmony.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural celebrations in Kiribati. But, Mira, let's not forget about Tajikistan, our second country for this topic. How do you think the social dynamics in Tajikistan compare to those in Kiribati?
Ah, great transition. Leah, Tajikistan is actually a fascinating country when it comes to social equality and respect for minorities. Despite its complex history and cultural diversity, the country has made significant progress in promoting social cohesion and inclusivity. For example, the government has implemented policies to support the rights of women and children, and the country has a strong tradition of community-based initiatives that promote social harmony.
That's terrific to hear. Mira, I've also heard that Tajikistan has a rich cultural heritage, with a blend of Persian, Arabic, and Russian influences. But I'm curious, how do you think the country's cultural diversity affects its social dynamics? For instance, how do people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds interact with one another?
Ah, excellent question. Leah, in Tajikistan, I've observed that people from different backgrounds often come together to celebrate cultural events and traditions. For example, during the annual Nowruz celebrations, people from all walks of life gather to share food, music, and dance. It's truly a beautiful display of cultural diversity and social harmony.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural celebrations in Tajikistan. But, Mira, let's talk about something specific. I've heard that Kiribati has a unique tradition of Timon Mopotiki, which is a celebration of the country's history and culture. Can you tell us more about this tradition?
Yes. The Timon Mopotiki is a truly special celebration that takes place every year in Kiribati. It's a time for the community to come together and share stories, music, and dance that reflect the country's rich cultural heritage. And Leo, I think this tradition is a great example of how Kiribati promotes social equality and respect for minorities.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural traditions in Kiribati. But, Mira, let's not forget about Tajikistan. How do you think the country's cultural diversity affects its social dynamics, especially when it comes to women's rights and empowerment?
Great question. Leo, in Tajikistan, I've observed that women play a significant role in promoting social cohesion and inclusivity. For example, many women are actively involved in community-based initiatives that promote education and economic empowerment for women. And, Leo, I think this is a testament to the country's commitment to promoting social equality and respect for minorities.
Wow, that's terrific to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the women's rights movement in Tajikistan. But, Mira, let's talk about something specific. I've heard that Tajikistan has a unique tradition of Taxation, which is a celebration of the Persian New Year. Can you tell us more about this tradition?
Yes. The Taxation is a truly special celebration that takes place every year in Tajikistan. It's a time for the community to come together and share food, music, and dance that reflect the country's rich cultural heritage. And, Leo, I think this tradition is a great example of how Tajikistan promotes social equality and respect for minorities.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural traditions in Tajikistan. But, Mira, let's not forget about Kiribati. How do you think the country's cultural diversity affects its social dynamics? Especially when it comes to promoting social cohesion and inclusivity.
Ah, great question. Leo, in Kiribati, I've observed that the community comes together to celebrate cultural events and traditions that promote social harmony. For example, during the annual Kiribati Day celebrations, people from all walks of life gather to share food, music, and dance. It's truly a beautiful display of cultural diversity and social harmony.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural celebrations in Kiribati. But, Mira, let's talk about something specific. I've heard that Kiribati has a unique tradition of Timon Lopodiki, which is a celebration of the country's history and culture. Can you tell us more about this tradition?
Yes. The Timon o Potiki is a truly special celebration that takes place every year in Kiribati. It's a time for the community to come together and share stories, music, and dance that reflect the country's rich cultural heritage. And, yeah, I think this tradition is a great example of how Kiribati promotes social equality and respect for minorities.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural traditions in Kiribati. But, Mira, it's time of to say. Let's not forget about Tajikistan. How do you think the country's cultural diversity affects its social dynamics, especially when it comes to promoting social cohesion and inclusivity?
Ah, great question. Leo, in Tajikistan, I've observed that people from different backgrounds. I'm fascinated by Kiribati's unique approach to taxation. They have a simple and transparent system with a flat rate of 10% on personal income. It's almost like a one-size-fits-all solution.
Ah, yes. And it's also worth noting that Kiribati has no sales tax or VAT. That's a significant advantage for long-term immigrants who want to live off their savings or retirement income.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting that Kiribati also has a relatively low tax threshold for foreigners. You only need to pay tax if your income exceeds $10, zero a year. That's quite a generous threshold, don't you think?
Indeed it is. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Kiribati has a social safety net in place, which includes a pension scheme for citizens and a healthcare system that's accessible to all residents.
That's right. And I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the pension scheme in Kiribati? Is it sufficient to support long-term immigrants in their retirement years?
Well, I think it's a good start, but it could be improved. The scheme is funded by a combination of government contributions and employee contributions, and it provides a modest pension to eligible citizens. However, I think it's essential to note that the pension scheme is not specifically designed for foreigners, so it may not be as comprehensive or generous as what you'd find in other countries.
Ah, I see. And what about Tajikistan? How does its taxation system compare to Kiribati's?
Well, Tajikistan has a more complex tax system, with a range of taxes and fees that can be quite high. The country has a flat rate of 10% on personal income, but there are also taxes on property, land, and businesses.
That sounds quite daunting for long-term immigrants. But I'm curious. Leo, what about the social safety net in Tajikistan? Is it similar to Kiribati's?
Actually, Tajikistan has a more limited social safety net, but it's still present. The country has a pension scheme for citizens, and there are also some healthcare services available to residents. However, the quality and accessibility of these services can vary depending on the region and the individual circumstances.
I see. And I think it's worth noting that Tajikistan has a relatively high tax threshold for foreigners. Similar to Kiribati, you need to earn above $10 a year to pay tax, which is a generous threshold.
That's right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both Kiribati and Tajikistan have a relatively low tax to GDP ratio, which means that the tax burden on residents is relatively light.
Ah, I see. And I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the retirement options for long-term immigrants in Kiribati and Tajikistan? Are there any specific schemes or plans that you'd recommend?
Well, I think it's essential to note that both countries have relatively limited retirement options for foreigners. However, Kiribati has a more comprehensive pension scheme. And it's also worth mentioning that the country has a relatively low cost of living, which can make it easier for retirees to stretch their income.
That's a great point. Leo, and I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social solidarity, which can be a significant advantage for long-term immigrants who want to integrate into local society.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a rich cultural heritage and a unique natural environment, which can make them attractive destinations for immigrants who want to experience a different way of life.
Ah, I see. And I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the overall attractiveness of Kiribati and Tajikistan as destinations for long-term immigrants? Are there any specific advantages that you'd highlight?
Well, I think both countries have their pros and cons. Kiribati has a relatively simple tax system, a comprehensive pension scheme, and a low cost of living, but it also has limited healthcare services and a relatively high cost of importing goods. Tajikistan has a more complex tax system, a limited social safety net, and a relatively high cost of living. But it also has a rich cultural heritage and a unique natural environment.
Ah, I see. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a relatively low cost of living, which can make them attractive destinations for immigrants who want to stretch their income. It's also essential to note that the cost of living can vary significantly depending on the region and the individual circumstances.
That's right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a strong sense of community and social solidarity, which can be a significant advantage for long-term immigrants who want to integrate into local society.
I see. And I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the overall quality of life in Kiribati and Tajikistan? Are there any specific aspects that you'd highlight as particularly attractive or unattractive?
Well, I think both countries have their pros and cons. Kiribati has a relatively high quality of life, with a low crime rate and a strong sense of community. But it also has limited healthcare services and a relatively high cost of importing goods. Tajikistan has a more complex quality of life, with a range of challenges and opportunities. But it also has a rich cultural heritage and a unique natural environment.
Ah, I see. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a relatively low cost of living, which can make them attractive destinations for immigrants who want to stretch their income. However, it's also essential to note that the cost of living can vary significantly depending on the region and the individual circumstances.
That's right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a strong sense of community and social solidarity, which can be a significant advantage for long-term immigrants who want to integrate into local society.
Ah, I see. And I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the overall attractiveness of Kiribati and Tajikistan as destinations for long-term immigrants? Are there any specific advantages or disadvantages that you'd highlight?
Well, I think both countries have their pros and cons. Kiribati has a relatively simple tax system, a comprehensive pension scheme, and a low cost of living. But it also has limited healthcare services and a relatively high cost of importing goods. Tajikistan has a more complex tax system, a limited social safety net, and a relatively high cost of living. But it also has a rich cultural heritage and a unique natural environment.
Ah, I see. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a relatively low cost of living, which can make them attractive destinations for immigrants who want to stretch their income. However, it's also essential to note that the cost of living can vary significantly depending on the region and the... Welcome back to our comparison podcast, where we explore the fascinating world of Kiribati and Tajikistan. Our topic today is the rate of meeting specific interests in these two countries. I'm Mira, and I'm super to dive into this with my co-host Leo.
Ah, yes. And I'm Leo. the self-proclaimed interest collector here to share my findings with you. So, let's get started. For those who don't know, Kiribati is a small island nation in the Pacific, while Tajikistan is a landlocked country in Central Asia. Both have their unique charm and ways of meeting specific interests.
That's right, Leo. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have a strong sense of community and cultural heritage. In Kiribati, for example, you'll find a vibrant culture that's deeply rooted in traditional practices and customs. Meanwhile, in Tajikistan, you'll experience a rich cultural tapestry influenced by its strategic location along the Silk Road.
Exactly. And speaking of Silk Road, have you heard about the ancient trade routes that connected Europe and Asia? Tajikistan is a treasure trove of history, with its stunning mountain landscapes and ancient cities like Penjiken. Meanwhile, in Kiribati, you can explore the beautiful coral reefs and marine life that surround the islands.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the specific interests that these countries have to offer. So, Leo, what do you think are some of the unique interests that people can pursue in Kiribati?
Great question. Mira, in Kiribati, you can find a range of activities that cater to different interests, from snorkeling and diving to traditional handicrafts and music. And did you know that Kiribati has a thriving art scene, with many local artists showcasing their talents through paintings, sculptures, and performances?
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners are curious about how people in Tajikistan meet their specific interests. So, Leo, what about Tajikistan? What are some of the unique interests that people can pursue there?
Well, in Tajikistan, you can find a mix of outdoor activities like hiking, trekking, and mountain climbing, as well as cultural pursuits like visiting ancient cities, attending traditional festivals, and learning about the country's rich history and mythology.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Tajikistan's rugged terrain and stunning natural beauty would attract adventure seekers and outdoor enthusiasts?
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that Kiribati's coral reefs and marine life would be a paradise for snorkelers and divers. But what about community engagement? How do people in both countries come together to share their passions and interests?
Great question. Leo, in Kiribati, you'll find a strong sense of community, with many locals gathering for traditional dances, music performances, and cultural events. Meanwhile, in Tajikistan, you can experience the vibrant street life, with its bustling markets, street food, and lively atmosphere.
That's so true, Mira. And I think it's wonderful to see how people in both countries come together to share their passions and interests. Whether it's through music, dance, or cultural events, there's always something to look forward to.
Well, this episode, folks, we hope you enjoyed our comparison of Kiribati and Tajikistan. As always, we'd love to hear from you, so please leave your comments and thoughts below. And don't forget to follow our Jet Off AI YouTube channel for more episodes like this. Take care and see you in the next one.
And don't forget to hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop. We'd love to hear from you and get your feedback on our content. Thanks for joining us. And we'll be back soon with more. Warmest wishes from us.